The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. One of the Cossacks took a greasy paper out of his breast pocket and held it out to Griagor, saying, "Here's our furlough paper." "What do I want it for?" "You might think we were deserting." "You can show it when you fall in with a punitive detachment," Griagor said with some annoyance. But nonetheless, before leaving them, he advised them, "Ride at night, and put up somewhere each day. Your paper's useless. See you don't get into trouble with it. Is it stamped?" "Our squadron hasn't got a stamp." "Well, you take my advice if you don't want to be thrashed with ramrods by the Kalmyks." Some 3 miles outside the village, perhaps 300 yards from a small wood which reached to the edge of the road, Griagor again saw 2 horsemen riding towards him. They halted and stood gazing for a moment, then turned sharply into the wood. "They haven't got any papers," Prokhor opined. "Did you see the way they turned off into the trees? They're deserting even in the daytime now, the devils." During the day, several other men turned off the road and hurried to hide when they saw Griagor and Prokhor. One elderly Cossack on foot, stealthily making his way homeward, plunged into a field of sunflowers and crouched down like a hare on the edge of the field. As they rode past him, Prokhor rose in his stirrups and shouted, "Hey, countryman, that's not the way to hide. You've hidden your head, but you're showing your arse." And with a pretense of fury he shouted, "Well, out you come, let's see your documents." The Cossack jumped up and, bending double, ran off through the sunflowers. Prokhor laughed uproariously, and was about to touch up his horse to chase the man, but Griagor halted him. "Don't play the fool. Let him go to the devil. He'll go on running until he's broken-winded, and he'll die of fright." "You're all wrong. You couldn't catch that man with barzois. He won't stop galloping for a good 10 miles. Did you see the way he tore through the sunflowers? Where does a man get all that energy from at such times? I'd like to know." He expressed some decidedly disapproving opinions about deserters generally, and remarked, "The way they ride, just like wolves. How did they get away? Tell me. You look out, Panteleyevich, or before long, you and I will be holding the front by ourselves." The closer they drew to the front, the more Griagor saw signs of the demoralization of the Dawn Army. That demoralization had set in just at the moment when, reinforced by the insurgents, the army had achieved its greatest success on the northern front. Already its forces not only were incapable of opening a decisive offensive and smashing enemy resistance, but would be unable to face any serious attack. In the district centers and villages where the front-line reserves were quartered, the officers were carousing incessantly. Baggage trains of all kind were groaning with property looted but not yet dispatched to the rear. Not more than 60% of the complement was left in any of the component forces. Cossacks were arbitrarily going on furlough, and the Kalmyk punitive detachments scouring the steppe were not strong enough to hold up the flood of mass desertion. In the occupied villages of the Saratov province, the Cossacks were behaving like conquerors in foreign territory. They were pillaging the population, raping the women, destroying the grain stocks, slaughtering the cattle. Reinforcements of callow youths and men over 50 were being drafted into the army. In the advancing companies there was open talk of unwillingness to fight, while the Cossacks in the forces moving towards Voronezh were flatly refusing to obey the officers. Rumor had it that instances of officers being murdered in the front-line positions were growing frequent. As dusk was falling, Griagor halted for the night in a small village not far from Balashov. A 4th Reserve Company of Cossacks drawn from older conscripts and an engineers' company of the Taganrog Regiment had occupied all the living quarters in the place. Griagor spent a good deal of time searching for quarters. He could have passed the night in the fields, as they usually did, but rain began to fall. Prokhor was shivering in one of his bouts of malaria, and so they had to spend the night somewhere under cover. At the entrance to the village, an armored car, which had been put out of action by a shell, stood by a large house surrounded with poplars. As Griagor rode past, he read the still legible inscription on its green side, "Death to the White Scum," and below it the name Fury. Horses were snorting at the tether posts in the yard. Human voices were to be heard. A campfire was burning in the garden behind the house. Smoke was drifting over the green crowns of the trees. Lit up by the glare, Cossack figures were moving around the fire. The smell of burning straw and burnt hog's bristles was carried away on the wind. Gregor dismounted and went into the house. "Who's the master here?" he asked as he went into a low-ceilinged room filled with people. "I am. What do you want?" A thick-set peasant leaning against the stove looked round at Gregor, but did not change his position. "Can we spend the night here? There are 2 of us." "We're already as crowded as seeds in watermelons," an elderly Cossack lying on a bench barked in a disgruntled tone. "I wouldn't mind, but we have got rather a lot in here," the master said in a deprecatory voice. "We'll find room somewhere. We can't spend the night in the rain, can we?" Gregor insisted. "I've got a sick orderly with me." The Cossack lying on the bench groaned, dropped his feet to the floor, and staring at Gregor said in a different tone, "Your Excellency, together with the master's folk there are 14 of us in 2 small rooms, and the 3rd is occupied by officers." "Maybe you could fit yourself up with them somehow," a second Cossack with a heavy sprinkle of gray in his beard, a non-commissioned officer, judging by his epaulets, said in a friendly tone. "No, I'd rather be here. I don't need much room. I'll lie on the floor. I shan't crowd you." Gregor removed his greatcoat, brushed his hair with his palm, and sat down at the table. Prokhor went out to see to the horses. Some time later, Gregor went out to the porch. A fine slanting rain lashed into his face. A flash of lightning lit up the spacious yard and wet fence, the lustrous gleaming foliage of the trees in the orchard. As he went down the steps he heard voices. "The officers still drinking?" someone asked, striking a match in the porch. A muffled, frozen voice answered with restrained menace, "They'll drink their fill. They'll drink their fill till they get what's coming to them." Chapter 9. In 12 months, the Melyakov family was reduced to half its number. Panteleimon was right when he remarked one day that death had taken a fancy to the hut. Hardly had they had time to bury Natalia, when once more the scent of incense and cornflowers filled the Melyakovs' spacious best rooms. Some 10 days after Gregor had gone back to the front, Daria drowned herself in the dawn. On the Saturday after returning from the fields, she went with Dunya to bathe. Below the kitchen gardens, they undressed and sat a long time on the soft, trampled grass. From early morning, Daria had been out of spirits, complaining of headache and weakness, and several times she had surreptitiously wept. Before stepping into the water, Dunya gathered her hair into a knot, tied it up in a 3-cornered kerchief, and glancing sidelong at Daria, said commiseratingly, "How thin you've got, Daria. Your bones seem to be all outside your skin." "I'll soon get better." "Has your headache gone?" "Yes." "Well, let's bathe, for it's late already." Daria was the first to enter the water at a run. She plunged in over her head and, coming up, snorting the water out of her nose and mouth, swam to the middle. The swift current caught her up and began to carry her away. Admiringly watching Daria as she shot forward with great masculine sweeps, Dunya waded in up to her waist, washed, wetted her breast and her sun-warmed, strong, femininely rounded arms. The 2 daughters-in-law of the Obnizovs were watering cabbages in a neighboring garden. They heard Dunya laughingly call to Daria, "Swim back, Dashka, or a sheet-fish will carry you off." Daria turned back, swam some 20 feet, then momentarily flung herself out of the water up to her waist, folded her arms behind her head, shouted, "Goodbye, women!" and went to the bottom like a stone. Some 15 minutes later, Dunya, white-faced, dressed in only her underskirt, ran into the Melyakovs' hut. "Daria's drowned, Mama!" She could hardly pant the words out. Not till the following day did they recover Daria's body with fishing tackle. At dawn, the oldest and most experienced fisherman in Tatarsk, Arkhip Peskovatkov, set the 6 ends of his tackle across the current below the spot where Daria had sunk, and later he went with Panteleimon to check the lines. A crowd of children and women gathered on the bank, Dunya among them. When, hitching up the fourth line with his oar handle, Arkhip had gone some 60 feet from the bank, Dunya distinctly heard him say in an undertone, "This seems like it." He began to draw in the tackle more carefully, pulling with obvious effort on the line, which ran plumb into the depths. Then, over by the right bank, there was a glimmer of white. Both the old men bent over the water, the boat scooped up water with its gunwales, and the muffled thump of a body hauled into the boat reached the ears of the silent crowd. A sudden shiver ran through them all. One of the women broke into a quiet sobbing. Christonia, who was standing a little way off, roughly shouted at the children, "Now clear out of here!" Through her tears, Dunya saw Arkhip standing at the stern, expertly and silently row with one oar to the bank. The boat touched ground, crushing through the fine chalky shingle with a jarring scrunch. Darya was lying with her legs tucked up lifelessly, her cheek against the wet bottom. Her white body was just beginning to turn blue, and deep holes, the marks of the hooks, were clearly visible in the flesh. On her lank, swarthy calf, just below the knee, by the linen garter, which evidently she had forgotten to remove before bathing, a fresh scratch was showing rosy and bleeding a little. The point of a hook had slipped over her leg and had furrowed a crooked, jagged line. Convulsively crumpling her apron, Dunya was the first to go up to Darya, to cover her with a sack ripped down the seams. With methodical haste, Panteleimon rolled up his trousers and pulled the boat up the bank. A wagon drove up a minute or two later, and Darya was carried to the Melyukovs' hut. Mastering her fear and feeling of disgust, Dunya helped her mother to wash the cold body, which still retained the iciness of the deep dawn current. There was something unfamiliar and stern about Darya's slightly swollen face, and the faded gleam of the eyes glazed by immersion in the water. Silver river sand sparkled in her hair, the moist threads of waterweed were vividly green against her cheeks, and in the outflung arms hanging helplessly from the bench was such terrible repose that as Dunya glanced at them she hurriedly fell back, amazed and horrified at the complete lack of resemblance between this dead woman and the jesting, laughing Darya who had been so much in love with life. Afterwards, as she recalled the stony clamminess of Darya's breasts and belly, the springiness of the stiffened limbs, Dunya long shook convulsively, and tried her utmost to forget it all. She was afraid the dead woman would visit her in her sleep at night, and for a week she slept in Ilinichna's bed, and before getting in prayed to God, asking, "Lord, don't let me dream of her. Cover me, Lord." If it had not been for the Obnizov women who had heard Darya shout goodbye women, she would have been buried quietly and without fuss. But when he heard of this last shout, which clearly indicated that Darya had intended to take her own life, Father Vissarion resolutely declared that he would not bury the suicide. Panteleimon was furious. "What do you mean you won't bury her? Is she unbaptized or what?" "I can't bury suicides. The law won't allow it." "Then how is she to be buried, in your opinion? Like a dog?" "In my opinion, how and where you like, except in the cemetery where honest Christians are buried." "But please do have some pity." Panteleimon tried persuasions. "We've never had such a disgrace in our family." "I can't. I've got great respect for you, Panteleimon Prokofyevich, as an exemplary church attendant, but I can't. It will be reported to the archdeacon, and I shan't be able to avoid the consequences." The priest turned obstinate. It was a disgrace. Panteleimon tried every means of persuading the pig-headed priest, promised to pay more and to pay in reliable Nicholas rubles, offered a yearling lamb as a gift, but seeing at last that arguments were of no avail, he resorted to threats. "I shan't bury her outside the cemetery. She's not some piece of make-weight, but my own daughter-in-law. Her husband fell in the struggle against the Reds and held officer's rank, and you talk nonsense like that to me. No, Father, it won't come off. You'll bury her for the sake of my respect. Let her lie in our best room for the time being, and I'll inform the district ataman about it at once. He'll talk to you." Panteleimon went out of the priest's house without a word of farewell, and in his temper even slammed the door. But the threat was effective. Half an hour later, a messenger came from the priest to say that Father Vissarion would be arriving to say the prayers in a minute. They buried Daria, as was right, in the cemetery beside Pyotra. When they dug the grave, Panteleimon took a fancy to the spot for himself. As he worked with the spade, he looked about him and reflected that he would not find a better place, nor was it worthwhile looking for one. Over Pyotra's grave, a recently planted poplar was rustling its tender branches. The oncoming autumn had already painted the leaves of its crown the yellow, bitter hue of decay. Calves had trampled out a path through the broken fence and between the graves. The road to the windmill ran past the fence. The trees, planted by the solicitous hands of the dead's kinsfolk, maples, poplars, acacias, and the wild-growing thorn, stood welcomingly green and fresh. Around them the bindweed twined exuberantly. Belated rape showed yellow. Wild oat and full-grained quitch were in ear. The crosses stood wound from foot to head with friendly blue convolvulus. The spot was certainly cheerful and dry. As the old man dug the grave, he threw down the spade from time to time and seated himself on the damp, clayey earth, to smoke, to think of death. But evidently the times had not yet arrived when old people could once more die quietly in their own huts and rest where their own fathers and grandfathers had found their last shelter. After Daria was buried, life grew still quieter in the Mihalyakovs' house. They carted the grain, threshed it, gathered a rich harvest from the melon plot. They expected news from Gregor, but nothing had been heard of him since his departure for the front. Ilinichna said more than once, "The devil doesn't even send greetings to his children. His wife's dead, and now he has no need of any of us." Then Cossacks on active service began to return more and more often on visits to Tatarsk. The rumors spread that the Cossacks had been beaten on the Balakhov front and were retreating towards the Don, there to take refuge behind the watery defense line and to act on the defensive until winter. But as to what would happen in the winter, all the front-line men talked of that without any attempt at secrecy. When the Don freezes over, the Reds will drive us right back to the sea. Panteleimon, zealously working at the threshing, did not seem to pay any particular attention to the rumors roving around the Don lands, but he could not remain indifferent to what was happening. He shouted even more frequently at Ilinichna and Dunya, grew more and more irritable as he heard that the front was drawing nearer. He not infrequently set to work to fashion something for the farm, but the work had only to go at all wrong in his hands for him to throw it down in a fury, and spitting and cursing he would rush to the threshing floor to allow his indignation to simmer down. Dunya was more than once the witness of such explosions. One day he set to work to mend a yoke. The job did not go well, and for no reason whatever the furious old man snatched up an axe and chopped at the yoke until only splinters were left. The same thing occurred with a horse collar he was mending. One evening by the fire he twisted a wax end and set to work to sew up the burst padding of the collar. Maybe the thread was rotten, or maybe the old man was too fidgety, but the thread broke twice in succession. That was enough. Swearing horribly, Panteleimon jumped up, sent his stool flying, kicked it towards the stove, and bellowing like a dog, tore at the leather padding of the collar with his teeth. Then he flung the collar to the floor and, hopping like a cock, started to jump on it. Hearing the noise, Ilinichna, who had gone to rest early, jumped out of bed in a fright. But seeing what was happening, she lost her temper and reproached him. "Have you gone mad, damn you, in your old age? What's the collar done to you?" Panteleimon gazed at his wife with frenzied eyes and roared, "Shut up, you this and that!" Snatching up a piece of the collar, he threw it at the old woman. Choking with laughter, Dunya flew like a bullet out into the porch. But after raging for a while, the old man calmed down, asked his wife's forgiveness for the words he had used in his anger, and scratched the nape of his neck for a long time as he stared at the fragments of the unfortunate collar, thinking out what they might be useful for. Such attacks of frenzy were repeated more than once, but instructed by bitter experience, Ilinichna found a different way of intervening. The moment Panteleimon began to belch out curses and smash up some domestic article, the old woman, humbly but loudly enough, remarked, "Smash it up, Prokofitch, break it up. You and I will yet make money for more." And she even attempted to assist in the destruction. Then Panteleimon at once simmered down, stared for a minute with vacant eyes at his wife, rummaged with trembling hands in his pockets, found his tobacco pouch, and sat down in bewilderment somewhere out of the way to smoke, to soothe his jangled nerves, inwardly cursing his explosive nature and reckoning up the losses he had sustained by his action. A 3-month-old pig, which made its way into the enclosure, fell a victim to his elderly unbridled anger. He broke its back with a stake, and 5 minutes later, after slaughtering the animal, as he was tearing off the bristles with a nail, he looked guiltily, wheedlingly at Ilinichna and said, "You know that pig was nothing but trouble. He'd have died in any case. They always get the plague at this time of year, and now we shall at least eat him, and he'd have been lost to us altogether. That's true, isn't it, old lady? Well, what are you looking like a thundercloud for? May he be triply damned, that pig. Now, if he'd been a pig as pigs go, but he was only a gammon. It didn't need a stake to kill him. Snot would have done it. And what a one he was for poking his snout into places. He'd rooted up a good 40 potatoes. If he'd eaten all the potatoes in the garden, there wouldn't have been more than 30 altogether," Ilinichna quietly corrected him. "Maybe, but if there'd been 40, he'd have spoilt all the 40. He was like that. And thank God we're saved from him. From the enemy," Panteleimon answered without thinking. The children grew bored after they had seen their father off. Occupied with the house, Ilinichna could not give them sufficient attention, and left to their own devices, they played for hours on end somewhere in the orchard or the threshing floor. Mishatka vanished one day after dinner and came back only at sunset. When Ilinichna asked where he had been, the boy said he had been playing with other boys down by the Don. But Polyushka at once gave him away. "He's telling lies, Granny. He's been to see Auntie Aksenia." "But how do you know?" Ilinichna asked, unpleasantly surprised by the news. "I saw him climb across the fence from their yard." "Is that where you've been? Now speak up, child. What are you going red for?" Mishatka gazed straight into his grandmother's eyes and answered, "I was telling you wrong, Granny. It's true I haven't been down by the Don, but with Auntie Aksenia." "What did you go there for?" "She called me and I went." "Why did you tell me you'd been with the boys?" Mishatka was dumb for a second, then he raised his eyes and whispered, "I was afraid you'd be angry." "Why should I be angry with you? No. But what did she want you for? What did you do there?" "Nothing. She saw me and shouted, 'Come here.' I went up to her. She led me into the hut, seated me on a chair." "Well?" Ilinichna asked impatiently, concealing the agitation which was mastering her. "She gave me cold pancakes to eat, and then she gave me this." Mishatka pulled a piece of sugar out of his pocket, showed it proudly, and hid it in his pocket again. "But what did she say to you? Did she ask you anything?" "She said I was to go and visit her because she was lonely all by herself, and she promised to give me a treat. She said I wasn't to tell anyone I'd been with her. She said you'd be annoyed." "Did she?" Ilinichna uttered, panting with suppressed indignation. "Well, and did she ask you anything?" "Yes." "Then what did she ask? Now tell me, darling, don't be afraid." "She asked me whether I missed my daddy. I said I did. She also asked when he would be coming back and what news there was of him, but I said I didn't know, and that he was fighting in the war. Then she seated me on her knee and told me a fairy story." Mishatka's eyes glittered, and he smiled. "It was a nice story, about someone called Vanya, and how swan geese carried him on their wings, and about Baba Yaga." Ilinichna pursed up her lips as she listened to Mishatka's confession. At the end she said sternly, "You're not to go there any more, grandson. It isn't good. And don't take any presents from her. You'd better not, or your grandfather will hear of it and give you a whipping. God grant grandfather doesn't find out, for he'd flay the skin off you. Don't go again, dear child." But despite the strict prohibition, 2 days later Mishatka visited the Astachovs' hut again. Ilinichna found out about it when she saw Mishatka's shirt. The torn sleeve, which he had not had time to mend in the morning, was darned perfectly, and a little new mother-of-pearl buttons showed white on the collar. Knowing Dunya had been busy with the threshing and could not find time during the day to mend the children's clothes, Ilinichna reproachfully asked, "Visited the neighbors again?" "Yes," Mishatka said in his confusion, and at once added, "I shan't any more, Granny, only don't be upset with me." Ilinichna decided to have a talk with Aksenia, and to tell her flatly that she was to leave Mishatka in peace, and not to wheedle herself into his favor, either with presents or by telling stories. "She's driven Natalia off this earth, and now the devil's trying to worm her way into the children's good books, so as to entangle Gregor through them. What a snake! Aiming at being my daughter-in-law with her own husband still alive, only nothing will come of it. And besides, would Gregor ever take her after such a sin?" the old woman thought. Her penetrating and jealous motherly eyes had not overlooked the circumstance that when Gregor was at home he had avoided meeting Aksenia. She realized that he had done so not out of fear of people's reproaches, but because he regarded Aksenia as guilty of his wife's death. Secretly, Ilinichna hoped that Natalia's death would part Gregor from Aksenia for all time, and that she would never become one of the Melyukov family. The same evening, Ilinichna saw Aksenia at the landing stage by the dawn and called to her. "Here, come over to me for a minute. I want to have a talk." Setting down her bucket, Aksenia calmly walked across and greeted Ilinichna. "This is the point, my dear," Ilinichna began, gazing interrogatively at her neighbor's beautiful but hated face. "What are you taking other folks' children away for? What are you calling the boy to you and talking to him for? Who asked you to sew up his shirt for him and give him presents? What's in your mind? That there's no one to care for him now his mother's gone? That we can't manage without you? Haven't you got any conscience, you with your shameless eyes?" "But what harm have I done? What are you annoyed about, grandmother?" Aksenia asked, flaring up. "What do you mean, what harm have you done? Have you any right to touch Natalia's child when you yourself sent her to her grave? How can you say such a thing, grandmother? Come to your senses. Who sent her to her grave? She laid hands on herself. And not because of you? I know nothing about that. But I do!" Ilinichna cried excitedly. "Don't shout, old woman. I'm not your daughter-in-law for you to shout at me. I've got a husband to do that. I can see you through and through. I see even what you're hoping for. You're not my daughter-in-law, but you'd like to be. First you want to win over the children, then you'll make up to Grishka. Isn't that it?" "I've got no intention of becoming your daughter-in-law. Are you going mad, old woman? I've got a husband still alive." "That's just the point. That you're trying to get away from a living husband in order to fasten yourself onto another." Aksenia noticeably turned pale and said, "I don't know what you're setting about me and abusing me for. I've never fastened myself onto anyone and never intend to. And what I said to your grandson, what harm is there in that? You know full well I've got no children of my own. I'm glad to see others' children, and so I called him. Do you think I loaded him down with presents? I gave him a lump of sugar, if that's what you call presents. And why should I give him presents anyway? You're gabbling about God knows what. You never called him into your hut when his mother was alive, but as soon as Natalia's dead, you suddenly grow good-natured." "He used to visit me even when Natalia was alive," Aksenia said with the least trace of a smile. "Don't tell lies, you shameless hussy. You ask him, and then call me liar if you like." "Well, I don't care how it was. Don't you dare to call him into your place any more. And don't take it into your head that you're going to find favor in Gregor's eyes that way. You'll never be his wife. Know that." Her face distorted with anger, Aksenia said hoarsely, "Hold your tongue. He won't ask you, and don't poke your nose into other people's affairs." Ilinichna was about to make some further retort, but Aksenia silently turned away, went to her buckets, heaved the yoke onto her shoulders, and splashing water as she went, swiftly strode up the path. From that time on, if she met any of the Melyukovs, she said not a word of greeting to them, but walked past with satanic pride, dilating her nostrils. But whenever she happened to see Mishatka alone, she timidly looked about her, and if there was no one near, ran up to him, bent down, and pressed him to her breast. Laughing and crying, kissing his sunburnt brow and sullen black little Melyukov eyes, she whispered disconnectedly, "My dear little Grigorievich, my darling, How I've been longing for you. Your Auntie Aksenia's a fool. Ah, what a fool!" Afterwards a tremulous smile long hovered on her lips, and her moistened eyes shone with happiness as brightly as those of a young girl. Part 5. Flight to the Sea. Chapter 1. At the end of August, Panteleimon was mobilized. With him, all the Cossacks capable of bearing arms in Tatarsk also went off to the front. Only war-wounded, youngsters, and the decrepit old men were left of the male population in the village. The mobilization affected everybody down to the last man, and only the obviously maimed were exempted by the medical commissions. When Panteleimon received the order from the village ataman to present himself at the assembly point, he hurriedly said goodbye to his old woman, his grandchildren, and Dunya, and groaning went down on his knees. He bowed himself twice to the ground, and crossing himself before the icons, said, "Goodbye, my dears. It looks as though we shan't be granted to see each other again. The last hour has come. My command to you is, thresh the grain both day and night. Try to get it finished before the rains set in. If necessary, hire a man to help you. If I don't come back by autumn, carry on without me. Plow up the autumn fields as much as you've got strength for, and sow rye, at least a couple of acres of it. Watch out, old woman, and carry on the work properly. Don't let your hands drop. Whether Gregor and I return or whether we don't, you'll need grain most of all. War is war, but it's a miserable life without bread, too. Well, God preserve you." Ilinichna accompanied her husband to the square, watched for the last time as he limped along at Kristonia's side, hurrying after the wagon, then wiped her swollen eyes with her apron, and made her way home without one look back. A heap of half-threshed wheat was awaiting her on the threshing floor. Milk was standing on the stove. The children had not had any food since morning. The old woman had a great many things to attend to, and she hurried home without stopping, silently bowing to the few women she passed, not entering into talk, and only nodding affirmatively when one of her acquaintances asked her commiserately, "Seen the soldier off, then?" Several days later, Ilinichna milked the cows at dawn, then drove them out into the lane, and was about to return to the yard when a muffled, oppressive thunder reached her ears. Looking around, she could not see even one little cloud in the sky. After a brief interval, the thunder was repeated. "Do you hear that music, old woman?" the old cowherd assembling the cows asked her. "What music?" "Why, all that bass music." "I can hear it all right, but I don't rightly know what it can be." "You'll know soon enough. When it starts coming from that direction, right over the village, you'll know at once. That's gunfire. They're shaking the guts out of our old men." Ilinichna crossed herself and silently went through the wicket gate. The gunfire sounded incessantly for 4 days. It was especially loud in the dawns and dusks. But when a northeasterly wind blew, the thunder of the distant battles could be heard in the middle of the day also. On the threshing floors, the work came to a halt for a moment. The women crossed themselves and sighed deeply, recalling their dear ones, whispering prayers. Then the stone rollers again rumbled muffledly on the threshing floors. The driver boys urged on the horses and bullocks. The day of toil entered upon its indefeasible rites. The end of August was fine and amazingly dry. The wind carried the chaff dust through the village. A sweet scent of threshed, rusty straw hung everywhere. The sun burned mercilessly, but the approach of the imminent autumn made itself felt in everything. The faded, dove-gray wormwood showed dimly white over the pasturage. The crowns of the poplars beyond the dawn turned yellow. The scent of the autumn apples in the orchards grew keener. The distant horizons turned autumnally clear, and the first flocks of migrating cranes were seen in the harvested fields. Baggage trains carrying military stores to the Don crossings rolled along the Hetman's highway from west to east. Refugees arrived in the Donside hamlets. They told that the Cossacks were making a fighting retreat. Some of them declared that this retreat was being carried out deliberately in order to lure on the Reds with the intention of surrounding and annihilating them. Some of the Tatarsk people began quietly to make ready for flight. They fed up their bullocks and horses, buried grain and chests filled with their most precious possessions in pits by night. The gunfire, which had died away on September 5th, was renewed with greater intensity, and now sounded distinct and menacing. The fighting was taking place some 25 miles beyond the Don, northeast from Tatarsk. A day later, gunfire could be heard rolling upstream from the west also. The front was steadily drawing nearer the river. Hearing that the majority of the villagers were preparing to leave, Ilinichna suggested to Dunya that they also should go. She felt bewildered and perplexed, and did not know what to do about the farm, the house, whether they should abandon it all and drive off with the others or should remain at home. Before his departure for the front, Panteleimon had talked about the threshing, about plowing, about the cattle. But he had not said one word indicating what they were to do if the front came near Tatarsk. In the end, Ilinichna decided to send Dunya and the children, together with their most valuable possessions, with one of the villagers, and to remain behind herself, even if the Reds occupied the village. During the night of September 17th, Panteleimon unexpectedly arrived home. He had come on foot from close to Kanzanska district center, and was worn out and ill-tempered. After resting for half an hour, he sat down at the table and began to eat as Ilinichna had never seen him eat before in all their life together. He threw a good half-bucketful of thin cabbage soup down his throat, then fell upon some millet porridge. Ilinichna clapped her hands in astonishment. "Lord, the way you're eating, Prokofitch! I'd say you'd had nothing to eat for 3 days." "Well, and do you think I have, you old fool? It's exactly 3 days since I last had a bite between my teeth." "Why, don't they feed you in the army, then?" "May the devils feed them like it," Panteleimon answered, purring like a cat, his mouth crammed to the lips. "Whatever you can get hold of, you guzzle, but I haven't learned to steal yet. That's all very well for the youngsters. They've got no conscience. Through this accursed war, they've got their hands so used to filching that I was aghast. But at last I got over it. They pinch everything they see and drag it off. It's not war, but a scourge of God. You'd better not eat your fill at one go. Something might happen to you. Look how you've swollen up, just like a spider. Hold your tongue. Bring me some milk and some more bread." Ilinichna burst into tears as she watched her famished husband. "Are you back for good?" she asked when at length he leaned back from his plate. "We'll see," he answered evasively. "I suppose they've let you old men go home." "They haven't let anybody go home. How can they when the Reds are pushing towards the Don? I just cleared out." "But won't you have to answer for it?" Ilinichna asked fearfully. "If they catch me, I may have to." "Why, are you going to bury yourself, then? And were you thinking I'd go visiting friends or seeing the sights? Pah, you stupid blockhead!" Panteleimon spat in his annoyance, but the old woman did not stop pestering. "Oh, what a sin! As if we hadn't enough sorrow now, they'll arrest you." "Well, and it may be better to sit in prison than go dragging over the steppe with a rifle," Panteleimon said wearily. "I'm no youngster to go marching 25 miles a day, to dig trenches, to attack at the double, and to crawl along on the ground and bury myself away from the bullets. The devil can bury himself from them. A bullet caught a comrade of mine from Krivaya Riechka right under the left shoulder blade, and he didn't even kick out his legs once. You don't get much pleasure out of such things." The old man carried his rifle and wallet of cartridges outside and hid them in the chaff shed. But when Ilinichna asked where his fur coat was, he answered moodily and reluctantly, "I've worn it out, or to be more exact, I threw it away. Beyond Shumilinsk, they pressed on us so hard that everybody dropped everything and ran like mad. There was no time to worry about coats then. Some men had sheepskins, and they threw even them off. And what the devil have you thought of the coat for? Now, if it had been a good one, but it wasn't fit for a beggar." In reality, the coat had been a good new one, but anything the old man had had to abandon was always no good at all, so he said. It was the way he had of consoling himself. Ilinichna knew that, and so she did not bother to argue about the quality of the coat. In a family council that night, they decided that Ilinichna and Panteleimon would remain at home with the children until the last moment, to look after their possessions, and to bury the grain that had been threshed, while Dunya would drive off with the yoke of old bullocks and the family chests to relations in the hamlet of Latyshev on the Chira. This plan was not destined to be carried out in its entirety. They saw Dunya off next morning, but at noon a punitive detachment of Kalmyk Cossacks rode into Tatarsk. One of the Tatarsk villagers must have seen Panteleimon making his way home. For an hour after their arrival, the Kalmyks galloped up to the Melyukov yard. Catching sight of the horsemen, Panteleimon scrambled up into the loft with extraordinary speed and agility. Ilinichna went out to meet the guests. "Where's your old man?" an elderly, well-built Kalmyk with sergeant's stripes asked, dismounting and pushing past Ilinichna through the wicket gate. "At the front? Where else should he be?" Ilinichna answered roughly. "Lead us to your house. We are going to search it." "What for?" "To look for your old man." "Ah, shame on you, an old woman like you, and telling lies." The youthful-looking sergeant shook his head reproachfully and bared his white, close-set teeth. "Don't you grin like that, you unchristened one. I said he's not here, and that means he's not here." "Drop your joking and lead us to your house. If you don't, we'll go by ourselves," the offended Kalmyk said sternly. He resolutely strode towards the porch, setting his outturned feet wide apart. They carefully searched the rooms, talked among themselves in Kalmyk. Then two went off to look in the backyard, while one, short and swarthy, almost black, with a pock-marked face and snub nose, pulled up his broad-striped trousers and went into the porch. Through the wide-open door, Ilinichna saw the Kalmyk jump, grip the crossbeam with his hands, and dexterously draw himself up. 5 minutes later he nimbly jumped down again, and behind him, groaning, smothered with clay, a spider web entangled in his beard, Panteleimon carefully clambered down. Looking at the old woman, who was standing with lips tightly pressed together, he said, "So they've found me, damn them. Someone must have told them." He was taken under escort to the district center of Kargin, where the field courts-martial were being held. Ilinichna wept a little, and listening to the renewed gunfire and the clearly audible rattle of machine guns beyond the dawn, went into the granary to hide at least a little of the grain. 14 captured deserters were awaiting trial. The trial was brief and merciless. The elderly captain, who was president of the court, asked the accused his name, his regiment, and found out how long he had been a deserter. Then he exchanged a few words in an undertone with the other members, a lieutenant who had lost one arm, and a bearded and puffy-faced sergeant out to curry favor, and announced the sentence. The majority of the deserters were sentenced to corporal punishment with the birch. The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 2, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. The majority of the deserters were sentenced to corporal punishment with the birch, the sentence being carried out by Kalmyks in an uninhabited house set apart specially for this purpose. Desertion had grown too extensive in the militant Don army to allow of open and public birching, as in 1918. Panteleimon was the 6th to be called before the court. Agitated and pale, he stood in front of the judge's table, his hands down his trouser seams. "Your surname?" the captain asked, not looking at the accused. "Melyukov, Your Excellency." "Your Christian name and patronymic?" "Panteleimon Prokofiev, Your Excellency." The captain raised his eyes from his papers and looked fixedly at the old man. "Where are you from?" he asked. "From Tatarsk village in Vishenska district, Your Excellency." "You're not the father of Squadron Commander Griegor Melyukov, are you?" "Yes, Your Excellency." Panteleimon at once recovered his spirits, feeling that, so to speak, the birch was drawing farther away from his aged body. "Listen, aren't you ashamed of yourself?" the captain asked, not shifting his prickly eyes from Panteleimon's sunken face. At that the old man, breaking all the regulations, laid his left hand on his chest and said in a weeping tone, "Your Excellency, Captain, make me say prayers to God for you for the rest of my life. Don't sentence me to be whipped. I had 2 married sons. The elder one was killed by the Reds. I've got grandchildren. And is it necessary to whip such a broken-down old man as I?"
We have to teach old men also how to serve. Did you think you'd be awarded crosses for running away from the forces? The one-armed lieutenant interrupted him. The corners of his mouth twitched nervously. What do I want a cross for? Send me to my regiment, and I shall serve in faith and truth. I don't myself know how I came to run away. The unclean spirit must have taken hold of me. Panteleimon went muttering on about the unthreshed grain, about his lameness, the neglected farm, but with a gesture the captain reduced him to silence, then bent over to the lieutenant and whispered into his ear. The lieutenant nodded, and the captain turned to Panteleimon. Good. Have you said all you want to say? I know your son, and I am astonished that he has got such a father. When did you desert from the forces? A week ago? Well, and do you want the Reds to occupy your village and to flay the skin off you? Is that the sort of example you show the young Cossacks? By law, we ought to condemn you and sentence you to corporal punishment. But out of respect for your son's rank as an officer, I spare you that disgrace. Were you a non-commissioned officer? Yes, Your Excellency. What rank? I was a corporal, Your Excellency. Reduced to the ranks. The captain raised his voice and roughly ordered, Report to your regiment at once. Inform your company commander that by decision of the field court-martial you are deprived of the rank of corporal. Did you have any awards for this or previous wars? Off with you. Beside himself with joy, Panteleimon went out, crossed himself as he faced the church cupola, and striking across the trackless hills, made his way home. Well, this time I shan't bury myself like that. It'll take devils themselves to find me. They can send 3 companies of Kalmyks to look for me, he thought, as he limped across the stubble field, overgrown with meadow grass. Out on the steppe, he decided that it would be better not to go along the road, in order not to attract the attention of people riding by. They'd be bound to think I was a deserter. I might run into soldiers, and they'd lay on the whip without trying me first, he deliberated aloud, turning off the plowed lands onto the neglected summer track overgrown with plantain, and already no longer thinking of himself as a deserter. The closer he drew to the dawn, the more frequently he fell in with refugees' wagons. The scenes which had occurred in the spring during the insurgents' retreat to the left bank of the river were now being repeated. Wagons and britskas, loaded with household treasures, and droves of bellowing cattle like cavalry on the march, stretched in all directions over the steppe. Flocks of sheep raised clouds of dust. The creaking of wheels, the neighing of horses, human shouts, the trample of innumerable hoofs, the bleating of sheep, children's weeping, filled the tranquil expanses of the steppe with incessant and disturbing noise. "Where are you off to, Grandad? Go back! The Reds are right behind us," a Cossack with bandaged head shouted from a passing wagon. "Fine talk! Where are the Reds?" Panteleimon halted in consternation. "On the farthest side of the Don. They're getting near Vyashenska. Are you going over to them?" Reassured on hearing that the river was between him and the Reds, Panteleimon continued his journey, and towards evening drew near to Tatarsk. As he dropped down from the hill, he carefully examined the terrain. The village amazed him by its deserted look. Not a soul was to be seen in the streets. Neither human voices were to be heard, nor the lowing of cattle. But down by the river itself, people were scurrying about actively. As he drew nearer, Panteleimon had no difficulty in recognizing that they were armed Cossacks drawing up barges and carrying them into the village. Tatarsk was completely abandoned by its inhabitants. Panteleimon could see that clearly. Cautiously turning into his side lane, he strode towards the hut. Ilinichna and the grandchildren were sitting in the kitchen. "Why, here's Granddad!" Mishatka cried out in delight, flinging his arms around the old man's neck. Ilinichna burst into tears of joy and said through her tears, "I never hoped to see you again. Well, Prokofyich, it's as you wish, but I'm not willing to stay here any longer. Let everything be burned to the ground, but I'm not going to watch over an empty hut. Almost everybody else has left the village, but here am I, sitting with the children like a fool. Harness up the mare at once and let's ride wherever we can. Have they let you go?" "Yes." "For good?" "For good, so long as they don't catch me." "Well, you can't hide here. This morning when the Reds were firing from the opposite bank, it was terrible. I took the children down into the cellar so long as it went on, but now they've been driven off. Some Cossacks came and asked for milk and advised us to clear out of here." "Cossacks?" "They're not our villagers, then?" Panteleimon asked with interest, closely examining a fresh bullet hole in the window frame. "No, they're strangers, from the Khapra, I think." "Then we've got to go," Panteleimon said with a sigh. Late in the afternoon he dug a hole under the dung-fuel heap, rolled 7 sacks of wheat into it, carefully filled it up, and piled dung-fuel bricks over it. As soon as dusk fell, he harnessed the mare into the wagonette, put 2 sheepskin coats, a sack of flour, millet, and a bound sheep in it, tied both cows to the back, and seating Ilinichna and the children on the sacks, said, "Well, and now God be with us." He drove out of the yard, handed the reins to his old wife, closed the gates, and as far as the hills strode along beside the wagonette, sniffling and wiping the tears away with his coat sleeve. Chapter 2. For 2.5 weeks, Panteleimon lived safely with his family in the little village of Latishev. Then he heard that the Reds had fallen back from the Don, and made ready to drive home. Some 3 miles outside Tatarsk, he climbed down with a resolute air from the wagon and said, "I can't stand any more of this foot-pace. And with those damned cows you can't go at a trot. What the devil did we drive them with us for? Dunya, halt your bullocks, tie the cows to your wagon, and I'll trot off home. Maybe there's only ashes left of our hut." Urged on by the greatest impatience, he transferred the children from his wagonette to Dunya's spacious wagon, put all the surplus load into it also, and with a lighter wagonette rattled over the humpy road at a trot. The mare sweated even during the first 2 miles. Never had her master treated her so mercilessly. He did not let the knout out of his hands, but incessantly whipped her on. "You'll overdrive the mare. What are you galloping along like an infidel for?" said Ilinichna, clinging to the ribs of the wagonette, painfully knitting her brows as she was violently jolted about. "In any case, she won't come to my grave to weep. Now, you devil, sweating like that, maybe there's only stumps left of our hut," Panteleimon said through clenched teeth. His fears proved unfounded. The hut stood whole, but almost all its windows were broken out, the door had been torn from its hinges, the walls were pitted with bullets, everything in the yard had a look of neglect and desolation. One corner of the stable had been carried away by a shell. A second shell had dug a shallow crater close to the well, smashing the frame and breaking the well crane in 2. The war from which Panteleimon had fled had itself come to his home, leaving behind it the hideous traces of its destruction. But still greater damage had been done to the farm by the Khopiersk Cossacks, who had been quartered in Tatarsk. In the cattle yard they had thrown down the fences and had dug trenches to the depth of a man's height. To avoid extra work, they had taken a granary wall to pieces, and had used the beams as flooring for the trenches. They had scattered stones from the stone wall when making a loophole for a machine gun. They had got rid of half a stack of hay, recklessly feeding it to their horses. They had set fire to the wattle fences, and had made a mess of the outdoor kitchen stove. When he had surveyed the house and the yard buildings, Panteleimon clutched his head. This time his usual habit of deprecating his losses forsook him. Damn it, he couldn't say that all he had lost had cost him nothing, and was good only for straw. A granary was not a coat, and it had cost no small sum to build. "It's just as though it had never been a granary," Ilinichna said with a sigh. "And it was a granary, too," Panteleimon said energetically. But he did not finish his sentence. He waved his hand and went into the threshing floor. The pock-marked walls of the house, mutilated with bullets and fragments of shell, looked forbidding and neglected. The wind was whistling through the rooms. Dust lay thickly on the tables and benches. It would take much time to put everything in order again. The very next day Panteleimon rode on horseback to Vyeshenska, and after some trouble wheedled out of his medical friend a document certifying that, owing to his leg trouble, the Cossack Panteleimon Prokofievich Melyakov was incapable of walking and needed a course of treatment. This certificate saved the old man from being sent back to the front. He presented it to the ataman, and whenever he went to the village administration to make his case look more convincing, he leaned heavily on his stick, limping on each leg in turn. Never before had life in Tatarsk involved so much bustle and disorder as after that return from the retreat. People went from yard to yard identifying their possessions, which had been scattered about by the Khopiersk Cossacks. They wandered over the steppe and through the ravines in search of cows separated from the herd. The very first day, Tatarsk came under artillery fire. A flock of 300 sheep had vanished altogether from the upper end of the village. According to the shepherd, one of the shells had burst just in front of the grazing flock, and the sheep, waving their thick tails, had torn off into the steppe in terror and had vanished. They were found some 25 miles away, a week after the inhabitants had returned to their deserted village. But when they were driven back and were sorted out, it appeared that half the flock were strange sheep, with an unknown clip in their ears, while more than 50 of the Tatarsk sheep were missing. A sewing machine belonging to the Bogatyryevs was found in the Myalyakovs' garden, while Panteleimon discovered the sheet-iron roof of his granary on Anikushka's threshing floor. The same sort of thing had happened in all the neighboring villages, and for a long time the inhabitants of near and far villages of the Donside area came visiting Tatarsk, and for a long time afterwards the questions were being asked, "You haven't seen a cow, red, with a bald patch on her forehead, the left horn broken short? A yearling bull, a dun, hasn't happened to wander into your village by any chance?" Without doubt, more than one yearling bull had been boiled in the Cossack squadron's cauldrons and cooked in the field kitchens, but spurred on by hope, the owners went striding across the steppe until they were convinced that they would never find all they had lost. Now he was released from service. Panteleimon energetically put the outbuildings and the fencing in order. Stacks of grain still unthreshed were piled on the threshing floor. The gluttonous mice went burrowing through them, but the old man did not set his hand to the threshing. How could he, when the farm stood unfenced? There was no sign of a granary, and everything on the farm bore the shameful stigma of disorder. In addition, bad weather set in with the autumn, and there was no chance of getting on with the threshing. Dunya and Ilinichna replastered and whitewashed the hut and helped Panteleimon to erect a temporary fencing and to do other jobs. Somehow or other they got hold of glass, reglazed the windows, cleaned up the summer kitchen, the well. The old man himself went down the well and evidently caught a cold down there, for he went coughing and sneezing with his shirt wet with sweat for a week. But he had only to drink a couple of bottles of homemade vodka at one sitting, then to lie a while on the hot stove, for his malady to vanish as though suddenly taken from him. There was still no news from Gregor, and only at the end of October did Panteleimon learn by chance that he was quite well, and with his regiment somewhere in Voronezh province. He gleaned this information from a wounded Cossack of Gregor's regiment who passed through the village. The old man cheered up mightily, and in his joy drank his last bottle of medicinal vodka distilled from red pepper. Afterwards he was talkative all day, and as proud as a young cock. He halted every passer-by to tell them, "Have you heard the news? Our Gregor's captured Voronezh. We've had a rumor that he's been raised in rank and is now commanding a division again, or possibly an army corps. You'd go a long way to find such warriors as him. You know yourself." So the old man spun his yarns, feeling an invincible necessity to share his joy, to brag. "Your son's a hero," the villagers told him. Panteleimon winked happily. "And how could he help being a hero when you know whose son he is? When I was young, I say it without boasting, I was no worse than him. My leg prevents me, or I wouldn't let him better me even now. If there were more of us old men at the front, we'd have taken Moscow long ago. But now we're marking time. We can't manage the peasants anyhow." The last person to whom Panteleimon happened to talk that day was old Beskhlebnov. He came past the Myalyakovs' yard, and Panteleimon did not fail to stop him with, "Hey, wait a bit, Filip Argyevich. How are you getting on? Come in for a minute and let's have a chat." Beskhlebnov came up and greeted Panteleimon. "Have you heard what a dance my Grishka's leading me?" Panteleimon asked. "Why, what's he been up to?" "They've put him in command of a division. That's the chaff he's in charge of now." "A division?" "Yes, a division." "You don't say." "But I do. Who else should they put in command of it? Tell me." "Of course."
Panteleimon exultantly stared at his companion and continued the conversation so dear to his heart. "I've got a son who's the astonishment of everybody. A chest full of crosses, what do you say to that? And the times he's been wounded and got contusions, any other man would have given up the ghost long ago, but it's nothing to him. It's like water on a duck's back. No, real Cossacks haven't yet died out altogether in the Don lands." "You're right there. But somehow we don't seem to get much benefit from them," old Beshlebnikov, who was never noted for garrulity, repeated thoughtfully. "How do you make that out? Look how far they've driven the Reds, right beyond Voronezh now, and they're getting near to Moscow." "They're taking a long time to get near." "It can't be done in a hurry, Filip Ageyevich. You've got to realize that in war nothing is ever done in a hurry. Hurried work is botched work. You've got to do everything little by little, according to the maps, according to the plans, according to all sorts of things. Peasants in Russia are as plentiful as grasshoppers, and how many of us Cossacks are there? A handful." "That's all true, but it looks as though our men won't be able to hold out for long. We must expect guests again by winter, so people are saying. If they don't take Moscow quickly now, then the Reds will be back here again. You're right so far as that goes." "But do you think they'll take Moscow?" "They ought to, but it's as God wills. Surely our men can manage it. The Cossacks have been raised down to the last man, and can't they manage it?" "The devil knows. And how about you? Done with fighting now?" "Oh, I'm a fine warrior, but if it wasn't for this trouble with my leg, I'd show them how to fight the enemy. We old men are a sturdy lot." "They say the sturdy old men ran so hard from the Reds on the other side of the Don that not one of them was left with a sheepskin. They stripped themselves of everything down to their skin and threw it all away. They say all the steppe was yellow with sheepskins, and it looked like a carpet of flowers." Panteleimon gave Beshlebnikov a sidelong glance and said dryly, "In my view, that's all lies. Maybe some of them did throw off their clothing to make things light, but why should people go and make it out 100 times worse than it is? A great matter. A coat, or even a sheepskin jacket. Life is more precious than that, or isn't it, I ask? And besides, it isn't every old man that can run well in his clothes. In this accursed war, you need to have legs like those of a barzoi bitch. And take me, for instance. Where am I to get legs like that? And why are you so upset about it, Filip Ageyevich? God forgive me, but what the devil is the use of them, the sheepskins, I mean, to you? It isn't a question of sheepskins or even coats, but of smashing the enemy as much as possible. That's so, isn't it? Well, so long. We've got talking and there's work waiting for me. Did you find your calf, by the way? Still looking for it, and no news of it. Well, I expect the Hopyersk men ate it. May it choke them. But don't you worry about the war. Our men will get the better of the peasants." And Panteleimon limped with an important air towards the steppes. But evidently it was not so easy to get the better of the peasants. The last Cossack offensive had not been achieved without losses. Only an hour later Panteleimon's cheerful mood was clouded by unhappy news. As he was adzing a beam for the well frame, he heard a woman crying and lamenting for the dead. The sounds came closer. Panteleimon sent Dunya to investigate. "Run and find out who's died," he said, setting his axe into the chopping block. Dunya quickly returned with the news that 3 dead Cossacks had been brought home from the Filonovsk front. Anikushka, Christonia, and another, a 17-year-old youngster from the far end of the village. Dumbfounded by the news, Panteleimon took off his cap and crossed himself. "May the Lord take them to his kingdom. What a fine Cossack he was," he said mournfully, thinking of Christonia, and recalling how recently he and Christonia had set off together from Tatarsk to go to the assembly point. He could work no longer. Anikushka's wife was howling as though she were being slaughtered, and lamenting so bitterly that the old man's heart sank. To get away from the heart-rending cry, he went into the house and shut the door fast behind him. In the best room, Dunya was sobbing as she told Ilinichna, I looked, dear Mamma, and Anikushka was almost without a head. It was like porridge instead of a head. Oh, it was horrible.
and he stank so much you could have smelt him a mile away. And why they brought them home I don't know. But Christonia was lying on his back right along the wagon. His legs were hanging out from under his greatcoat. He was clean and so white as though he'd been boiled. Only under his right eye was a little hole, very small, no bigger than a kopeck piece, and behind his ear blood was caked. Panteleimon spat furiously, went into the yard, took the axe and an oar, and limped off to the dawn. As he went, he called to Mishatka, who was playing close to the summer kitchen, "Tell your granny I've rowed across the river to cut down brushwood. Do you hear, my dear?" In the forest beyond the dawn, a quiet, gracious autumn had settled. The dry leaves were falling with a rustle from the poplars. The bushes of thorn seemed wrapped in flame, and among their scanty leaves the crimson berries flamed like little tongues of fire. The bitter, all-conquering scent of rotting oak bark filled the forest. Bilberries, dense and clinging, entangled the ground. Beneath the network of their creeping branches, smokily dove-blue, ripe bunches of berries hid artfully from the sun. In the shade, dew lay on the dead grass until noonday. A spider web glittered silver with its beads. Only the methodical tapping of the woodpecker and the twittering of the missel thrushes violated the silence. The taciturn, severe beauty of the forest had an appeasing effect on Panteleimon. He stepped quietly among the bushes, his feet scraping the damp coverlet of the fallen leaves, thinking, "That's life, that is. Only recently they were alive, and today they're robbed of life. What a Cossack's been knocked over. And it seems only the other day that he came and visited us, and stood down by the river when we fished out Daria. Oh, Christian, Christian, an enemy bullet has been found for you too now. And Anikushka, what a cheery sort he was. He loved drinking and laughing, and now he's only a corpse." Panteleimon recalled Dunya's description, and with unexpected clarity calling to mind Anikushka's smiling, whiskerless, emasculated face, he simply could not imagine him lifeless, with shattered head. "I did wrong to anger God by boasting about Gregor," he reproached himself as he recalled his talk with Beskrebnov. "Maybe Gregor himself is lying somewhere now, pecked to bits by bullets. God forbid and prevent that. What would us old folk have left to live with then?" A brown woodcock starting up from under a bush made Panteleimon fall back in alarm. He aimlessly watched the little bird's slanting, impetuous flight, then went on. By a small forest pool he took a fancy to several bushes of brushwood and set to work to cut them down. As he worked, he tried not to think of anything. In 1 year, death had struck down so many dear ones and friends that at the very thought he was oppressed, and all the world faded and seemed to be enveloped in a film of black. "Now I must cut down that bush. It's good brushwood, that. Just right for making wattle fencing," he talked aloud to himself, in order to distract himself from his gloomy thoughts. When he had worked long enough, he removed his jacket, sat down on the pile of cut brushwood, and avidly drawing in the pungent scent of faded leaves, gazed long at the distant horizon, merged into an azure haze, at the copses gilded with autumn, adorned with their last beauty. Not far off stood a maple sapling. It was indescribably beautiful, gleaming under the cold autumnal sun, and its spreading branches, burdened with purple foliage, were unfolded like the wings of some legendary bird about to soar up from the earth. Panteleimon sat long admiring it. Then he happened to glance down at the pool, and in the translucent, stagnant water saw the dark backs of great carp floating so close to the surface that he could see their fins and their wriggling purple tails. Occasionally they disappeared under the green shields of water lilies, then swam out again into clear water, darting at the wet, drowning leaves fallen from a willow. By autumn the pool had almost dried up, and it would not take a great deal of effort to catch those carp. After a little search, Panteleimon found a sack without a bottom to it, abandoned beside a neighboring pond. He returned to the pool, removed his trousers, and groaning with the cold, his flesh bristling, waded through the water with the sack, pressing its lower edge against the bottom of the pool. Then he thrust his hand inside, feeling sure a powerful fish would be splashing and bubbling in it. His labors were crowned with success. He managed to catch 3 carp, each weighing a good 8 pounds. But he could not continue his fishing any longer, for owing to the cold his maimed leg began to cramp. Satisfied with his catch, he wiped his legs dry, dressed, and again set to work to cut down brushwood in order to get warm. All the same, he had done a good day's work. It wasn't everybody's luck to catch 3 fish nearly 30 pounds in weight like that. The fishing had distracted his thoughts, driven away his gloomy mood. With the intention of returning to catch the remaining fish, he carefully hid the sack and looked about him anxiously to make sure no one had seen him as he threw the fat, golden, almost pig-like carp onto the bank. Then he strung the fish on a switch, lifted his bundle of brushwood, and unhurriedly made his way to the river. With a satisfied smile he told Ilinichna of his fisherman's luck, and once more admired the ruddy copper hue of the carp. But Ilinichna was not ready to share his raptures. She had been to look at the dead men, and had come back tear-stained and sorrowful. "Are you going to see Anikushka?" she asked. "No, I shan't. Haven't I ever seen dead men before? I've seen enough to last my lifetime." "You ought to go. Other folk'll think it strange. They'll say you didn't even call to pay your last respects." "Oh, leave me alone, for Christ's sake. He wasn't godfather to the children, and there's no reason why I should pay my last respects," the old man snapped back furiously. Nor did he go to the funeral. He rode across the river early in the morning and spent all day in the forest. While he was in the forest, he heard the bell tolling and felt impelled to take off his cap, to cross himself. But then he grew annoyed with the priest. Was there any sense in ringing the bell so long? He could have tolled the bell and been done with it, but it went on ringing for a whole hour. And what good came of all that ringing? It only wrenched people's hearts and made them think unnecessarily of death. And as it was, in the autumn, everything reminded you of death. The falling leaves, and the geese flying and crying through the azure sky, and the dead-lying grass. Despite all his attempts to spare himself any kind of painful experience, he was destined to suffer a new blow ere long. One day after dinner, Dunya glanced out of the window and said, "Why, they're bringing back yet another man killed at the front. His saddle charger is walking tied by the leading rein behind the wagon, and they're driving ever so slowly. One man's driving the horses, and there's a dead man lying under a greatcoat. The man driving is sitting with his back to us, and I can't see whether he's from our village or not." Dunya gazed fixedly, and her cheeks went whiter than linen. "But it's... she whispered incoherently, and suddenly gave a piercing scream. "It's Grishka they're bringing! It's his horse!" Crying, she ran out into the porch. Ilinichna covered her eyes with her palm and remained sitting at the table. Panteleimon rose heavily from the bench and went towards the door, stretching out his hands before him as though he were blind. Prokhorzikhov opened the gates, glanced at Dunya as she ran down the steps, and said in a cheerless tone, "Here's a guest for you. You weren't expecting us, were you?" "Our darling, my darling brother," Dunya groaned, wringing her hands. Only then, as he stared at her face, wet with tears, at Panteleimon standing speechless on the steps, did Prokhor think of saying, "Don't get alarmed, don't get alarmed. He's alive. He's got typhus." Panteleimon weakly leaned his back against the doorpost. "He's alive!" Dunya shouted to him, laughing and weeping. "Grishka's alive! Do you hear? They've brought him home ill. Go and tell Mother. Well, what are you standing there for?" "Don't be alarmed, Panteleimon Prokofitch. I brought him back alive. But don't ask after his health," Prokhor hurriedly confirmed as he led the horses into the yard. Panteleimon took a few uncertain paces, then sank down on one of the steps. Dunya flew like a whirlwind past him into the house to reassure her mother. Prokhor halted the horses by the steps and looked at Panteleimon. "What are you sitting there for? Fetch a hurdle, and we'll carry him in." The old man sat without speaking. The tears were streaming from his eyes, but his face was rigid, and not a muscle quivered on it. Twice he raised his hand to cross himself and dropped it, powerless to lift it right to his forehead. Something bubbled and gurgled in his throat. "I can see you're crazed with fear," Prokhor said commiserately. "Why didn't I think of sending someone on to warn you? I was a fool, a real fool, and no mistake. Well, get up, Prokofitch. The sick man's got to be carried in all the same. Where's a rug? Or shall we carry him in our arms?" "Wait a bit," Panteleimon said hoarsely. "My legs seem to have given way. I thought he was killed. Glory be. I didn't expect—" He tore away the button at the neck of his old shirt, threw open the collar, and gulped in air with his gaping mouth. Get up, Prokofitch," Prokhor hurried him. "There's nobody else but us to carry him in, is there?" With obvious effort, Panteleimon rose, went down the steps, threw back the greatcoat, and bent over the unconscious Griegor. Something again began to gurgle in his throat, but he mastered himself and turned to Prokhor. "Take hold of his legs. We'll carry him." They carried Griegor into the best room, took off his boots, undressed him, and laid him in the bed. Dunya anxiously called from the kitchen, "Father, Mother's bad. Come here." Ilinichna was lying on the kitchen floor. Dunya was on her knees beside her, sprinkling water on her ashen face. "Run and fetch old woman Kapitonovna, quick! She knows how to let blood. Tell her your mother must have her blood let. Tell her to bring her instruments with her," Panteleimon ordered. But Dunya, a girl of marriageable years, could not run through the village with head uncovered. She snatched up a kerchief and said as she hurriedly wrapped her head, "The children are frightened to death. God, what a blow this is! Look after them, Father, and I'll be off in a moment." Possibly Dunya might even have stopped to glance into the mirror, but Panteleimon, who had now recovered, looked at her with such a fierce expression that she fled headlong out of the kitchen. As she ran out of the wicket gate, she saw Aksiniya. There was not a drop of blood in Aksiniya's white face. She was standing, leaning against the wattle fence, her hands hanging lifelessly. No tears glittered in her filmy black eyes, but in them were so much suffering and dumb entreaty that Dunya halted for a second and said reluctantly, surprising herself, "He's alive, alive, he's got typhus." She ran off along the side lane at full speed, steadying her supple, dancing breasts with her hands. From all sides, inquisitive women were hurrying to the Melyukovs' yard. They saw Aksiniya slowly walk away from the Melyukovs' wicket gate. Then she suddenly hastened her steps, bowed her head, and covered her face with her hands. Chapter 3. Griegor was well again within a month. He first rose from his bed towards the end of October, and tall, as gaunt as a skeleton, uncertainly walked about the room and halted by the window. A young, thin snow showed a dazzling white on the ground and on the straw-thatched roofs. The tracks of sledge-runners were visible along the side lane. A bluish rime feathered the fences and trees, glittering and giving off rainbow colors under the rays of the setting sun. He stood gazing long out of the window, smiling thoughtfully, stroking his mustache with his bony hands. One would have thought he had never seen such a glorious winter before. To him everything seemed unusual, imbued with freshness and meaning. After his illness his sight seemed to have grown keener, and he began to discover new objects in his surroundings, to find changes in things which he had known for many years. He unexpectedly developed a far from characteristic curiosity and interest in everything occurring in the village and on the farm. Everything in his life acquired a new, secret significance. Everything attracted his attention. With eyes expressing a slight astonishment, he gazed at the new world which had been revealed to him. Over his face hovered a simple, childlike smile, in strange contrast to his harsh features, to the expression of his animal-like eyes, and softening the cruel folds at the corners of his lips. Occasionally he picked up and examined some object of domestic use which he had known since childhood,
tensely knitting his brows and looking at it as though he were someone recently arrived from a strange, distant land, and seeing it all for the first time. Ilinichna was amazed beyond measure one day to find him examining a distaff from all sides. The moment she entered the room, he stepped away from the distaff, looking a little sheepish. Dunya could not look at his bony, lanky figure without laughing. He walked about the room, dressed only in his underlinen, holding up his slipping pants with one hand, hunching his back, uncertainly straddling his thin, shanky legs. And when he sat down, he was always afraid of falling and clutched at something with his hand. His black hair, grown long during his illness, was falling out. His curly, grizzled forelock was lank. He got Dunya to help him shave his head, and when he turned his face to his sister, she let the razor drop to the floor, clutched at her belly, and falling on the bed, nearly choked with laughter. Gregor patiently waited for her to laugh her fill, but at last he could wait no longer, and said in a feeble, quivering tenor voice, "Look out, you're not far from sinning. You'll be ashamed afterwards. You're a woman now, you know." A hint of injury sounded in his words. "Oh, my brother, my dear, I'd better go. I haven't the strength. Oh, what do you look like? Why, you're an absolute scarecrow." Dunya could hardly get the words out between her attacks of laughter. "I'd like to see what you'd look like after the typhus. Pick up the razor now." Ilinichna took up the cudgels on his behalf, saying in a vexed tone, "And what are you neighing at, after all? You're a fool, Dunya." "But see what he looks like, Mother," Dunya said, wiping away her tears. "His head's all bumps. It's as round as a watermelon and just as dark. Oh, I can't any more." "Give me a mirror," Gregor asked. He looked into the tiny scrap of mirror, and then himself laughed long and noiselessly. "What did you shave your head for, son? You'd have done better to have left it as it was," Ilinichna said discontentedly. "So you think it's better to go completely bald?" "Well, even as you are, it's a terrible disgrace." "Oh, you're the limit," Gregor said angrily, whipping up a soapy foam with his brush. Unable to go outside the house, he spent much time with the children. He talked with them about everything, but avoided mentioning Natalia. One day, however, Polyushka nestled against him and asked, "Daddy, won't Mummy be coming back to us?" "No, dear. You don't come back from there." "From where? From the cemetery?" "You see, the dead just don't come back." "But is she quite dead?" "Why, what else could she be? Of course she's dead." "But I thought she might sometimes long for us and come." Polyushka whispered almost inaudibly, "Don't think about her, my dear. It's better not to," Gregor said huskily. "How can I help thinking of her? But don't they ever come to see you? Not even for a tiny bit? Never?" "No. Now go and play with Mishatka." Gregor turned away. Evidently his illness had sapped the strength of his will. Tears appeared in his eyes, and to hide them from the children he stood a long time at the window, his face pressed to the glass. He did not like talking to the children about the war, but Mishatka was more interested in the war than in anything else in the world. He frequently pestered his father with questions. How did people fight? And what were the Reds like? And what did they kill them with? And what for? Gregor's face clouded, and he answered irritably, "So you're singing that same old song again. What is it worrying you for, this war? Let's talk of how we'll catch fish with hooks when summer comes. Shall I make you a hook? As soon as I can get out into the yard, I'll twist you a line of horsehair." He felt an inward shame whenever Mishatka began to talk about the war. He could find no answers whatever to the child's artless and simple questions. Who can say why? Maybe it was because he himself had not found answers to these questions. But it was not so easy to shake off Mishatka. He seemed to listen attentively to his father's plans for going fishing, but afterwards asked again, "Daddy, have you killed anybody in the war?" "Stop plaguing me, little burr." "But is it terrible to kill them? And does the blood run out of them when they're killed? Lots of blood? More than out of a chicken or a sheep?" "I've told you to stop all this talk."
Mishatka was silent for a moment, then said thoughtfully, "I saw Granddad slaughter a sheep recently. I wasn't afraid. Just a little teeny bit, perhaps, but not at all, really." "Drive him away," Ilinichna said angrily. "He'll grow up to be another murderer, a real criminal,